Big Topics series. I think this one fits. There's no way anyone can do justice to integrating psychology and economics in just 1 hour, even with Jeremy's thoughtful interview. But I will say that I think accounting researchers are particularly well suited for this topic. And so, think a little bit about what's our comparative advantage as a discipline. What makes us different? Now, the obvious difference is we're interested in accounting questions, but setting aside the topical interest, what gives us a competitive advantage of accounting researchers over other social sciences? And I would argue it's our diversity. I would argue that it's the fact that we know more psychology than the typical economist does. We're trained in a more diverse way, at least collectively. And in fairness, you can flip that around. We know more economics than the typical psychologist. And so I think we can bring to the table different perspectives that you wouldn't ordinarily see if, dare I may use the term, pure disciplines. And so we gain when we leverage our scholarly diversity. It's one of the things that I've really appreciated at being at a very diverse school like the University of Texas, where we kind of have faculty members doing a little bit of everything. And you learn from that, and you gain from others' perspectives and insights, even when they don't perfectly match your own. And so, so let me, this might be a little bit controversial, hopefully not too much, but start out to kind of provoke you guys a little bit with some words that I think are misused in our literature. I'll start with the big one, behavioral. Is behavioral a subset of what we do, or is it all of what we do? In some sense, I would argue it's more the latter. This is a behavioral science. We are interested in behavior involving performance reporting and financial reporting. So to the extent that behavioral becomes a subset term, uses sort of brush into a niche, a subset of the literature that deals with other topics, rooted in psychology, I think we missed the point. So, matter of fact, my colleague Lisa Kuntz kindly sent me a commentary of Richard Thaler. It's like 20 years old, but I love this quote. It says, I predict that in the not too distant future, and we'll see if we agree whether his prediction's true or not, behavioral finance will be correctly viewed as a redundant phrase. What other kind of finance is there? And I argue the same point can be made for accounting. I don't care if you're the most hardcore analytic theorist in the world, ultimately you're modeling behavior. That's what we're about. Similarly, I think the word anomaly is misused. Matter of fact, there's kind of a little interesting trivia aside here. If you go back and look at Richard Sloan's classic article on the accrual anomaly, you will not find the word anomaly in that article one bit. Just do a search on it. It doesn't appear in the article, right? It was a description of a phenomenon which has multiple explanations and spawned a whole literature. But again, anomaly can be used to sort of dismiss things that we don't necessarily like to talk about or that are atypical from our perspectives. But at the end of the day, we're predicting how people behave, and what makes systematic behavior anomalous. I'm not so sure. This one's kind of personal to me, empirical. I don't know if this will offend the analytic theorists too much, but at least within the experimental community, it's always bothered me that empirical is used for archival research. This dates all the way back to my dissertation. This is in the mid-1980s. I did an experimental dissertation, and one of the members of the faculty, it was not my dissertation chair, Rashad Abdulkhalik is innocent, but one of the members of the faculty said, "You call this an empirical study. This isn't an empirical, it's just a dumb experiment." And I'm thinking empirical at the end of the day means data, and data can come from a number of sources, and we ought to integrate that. And finally, here's where I probably will offend a couple of my analytic modeler friends. I don't think anyone has squatters' rights over the word theory. Do I believe that analytic models can build theory? Absolutely, yes, 100%. Do I think that's the only way to build theory? No. Okay. Do I think theory requires equations? No. And so at the end of the day, for me at least, theory is an explanation. Theory is a rationale. It's a reason why something happens. And we ought to have a broad, fairly open-minded view of theory rather than a narrow view. It's just my perspective. And so I will say, though, that the literature, I've been around doing this at the University of Texas for 33 years, longer yet if you add my PhD program. So I've been around for a while. And I will say in the course of my academic career, we've come a long way. The literature is much more open-minded now than it was when, let's say, I was a PhD student. I'm going to pick on a couple of Nicks here, Nick Ganitas and the late and great Nick Dopich here, who back in a long, long time ago, 1974, wrote a fairly influential article in the JAR supplement that was frankly very critical of a number of points of the literature, but primarily experiments. There, some people might not believe it, but go back in the 1960s and early 1970s, you actually will see a fairly large number of behavioral experiments. And they come into pretty solid attack by the mid 1970s. And the reason was market efficiency. And so these are direct quotes. Even if these experimental studies were based on an explicit theory, it's still not apparent that their results would be pertinent to capital markets agents. To see this, consider the implications of capital market efficiency. Since the lab field studies concentrated on individual behavior rather than competitive market phenomena, their relevance to the issues at hand seems non-existent. It's with some irony that the late Nick Dopich actually turned to experimentation during the latter part of his scholarly career. I think Nick would argue, if he was here with us today, that the kind of experiments he did were the more interactive experiments that maybe touched on some of these questions. But nevertheless, let me just say, I think we've come a long way. If you want to see my further pontifications on this point, I had the honor of writing a virtual issue in JAR, just came out in October 2020, on experimental research. And the editors kindly gave me some free rein. And so I commented on how I thought the literature had evolved and had become open-minded over time. In a nutshell, my take is research ought to be a matter of science, not dogma. At the end of the day, we are people who are searching for a better understanding of human behavior, whatever it might be, not necessarily support for our scientific religions. I've never bought into this sort of postmodernist philosophy of science that we all have, vested interest in outcomes. I don't think that any researcher can be fully independent, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. With respect to psychology and economics, I think it's a fool's errand. It's foolhardy to sort of argue who's right and who's wrong. They're both right. Does psychology predict human behavior? Of course it does. Does economics predict human behavior? Of course it does. The issue is not who's right and who's wrong. It's a question of in which context do you see these different forces play out. We ought to conduct research to gain more sophisticated insights that meld these perspectives, combine them, not necessarily declaring winners or losers. I'm going to give one quick example, then I'll wrap up and turn it over to Jeremy. So on the issue of incentives, there's been a fairly fundamental debate in the literature over whether incentives improve performance, particularly on unusual tasks that require unconventional approaches. Okay, it's not just a straightforward effort approach. It's something that requires unusual insight. Economists generally assume that incentives promote more of what you incentivize, but psychologists take a different bent on that. The literature to date, the articles I've seen generally either states a case that incentives are bad or states a case that incentives are good. Both sides, in my opinion, tend to talk past each other rather than with each other. So I'm not going to say that this article, or not article, I wish it's an article, it's a working paper at this point, one of my most recent projects that I've had the privilege to do with Alan Webb and Michael Williamson. It kind of continues a program of study I've done. The only commonality of all these things have been done with Michael Williamson in different co-authorship teams, often with a third co-author, in this case, Alan Webb at the University of Waterloo. The latest gyration on this program is something called Do Performance Contingent Incentives Help or Hinder Divergent Thinking? It's on SSRN if anyone's interested by these comments. But basically, we're not trying to declare a winner. We're just trying to compete different perspectives on incentives. And so we do find, and we're not the only ones who have found this, others have found it in the past, that incentives make things worse. What do I mean by incentives? I mean, we pay people, they get considerably more money for every one of these so-called insight problems that they correctly solve. And if you pay people per correct solution, you somewhat ironically get fewer correct solutions. It works backwards. They do better with fixed pay than they do with performance-based pay. What the heck is an insight problem? Here's a classic one. So this is a desk lamp and a classic insight problem. I didn't make this up. This goes back 20 years, but the desk lamp is screwed to the wall. And in the original form of the problem, there's nothing else in the room at all. You're in a completely empty room. There's nothing there at all. How do you get this desk lamp off the wall just based on the desk lamp? That's all you have. Your pockets are empty. You don't have access to anything. And the solution is that electric plug. And so basically you have to have the insight to realize, at least in the United States, Europeans can't do this because their plugs are different. But in the United States, our plugs are flat. And so the solution is to use one of the prongs of the electric plug as a makeshift screwdriver. All right, so a little gimmicky, sure. But the point is, if you give people this problem and a host of other problems like them, even paying them non-trivial amounts of money for every one they get right, every one they can solve, actually makes things worse. Okay. And so that's what the psychologists would argue. It fixates people on the correct answer. I'm trying so hard to force the correct answer that I can't take a step back and relax, smell the flowers, and let the insight come to me that I should just use the electric plug instead of forcing the answer. Well, that's not the end of the story. That's not the end of the story. We flip it around. We take these exact same insight problems and we just twist it in a very minor way. We say, okay, it's fairly unrealistic to say you're in a completely empty room with nothing, all right? You don't have a screwdriver. There's no obvious solution. The easiest way to get the lamp off the wall is use a screwdriver, you know, but you don't have a screwdriver. What else could you use, to get this lamp off the wall? And now you see an exact flip of the results. Now economic incentives to solve this problem lead to people to say, well, gosh, I could use a small coin. I could use a paper clip. I could use the handle of a spoon. I could use a phone charger. I could use a pull tab from a pop can. So when you incentivize, if for lack of a better term, brainstorming, when you align the incentive with the objective of divergent thinking to get that lamp off the wall, the same incentives that harm performance before now significantly improve performance. So I dwell on this not just to promote my own paper, but to point out there's no winner here and there's no loser. We're not saying in psychology is right and economics wrong, nor are we saying the opposite. We're saying the key is to figure out when and why, and we attempt to develop theory. I don't have time to go through it, but read the paper if you're interested. We attempt to develop theory, a cognitive theory, as to why you might see a beneficial effect of performance contingent incentives in one setting and a harmful effect in another setting.